Reinhard Heydrich, often described by contemporaries as one of the most dangerous men in the Nazi regime, was assassinated in Prague in June 1942, 3 years before the first Nuremberg War Crimes Trial convened. Any discussion of what would have happened to him at Nuremberg is therefore necessarily counterfactual, but it can be grounded in the legal framework of the trials, the evidence assembled by the Allies, and the way other senior SS leaders were prosecuted and judged. Had Heydrich survived the war and been captured, his fate at Nuremberg would almost certainly have been among the most severe of all defendants. By the time of his death, Heydrich occupied a unique position within the Nazi power structure. As chief of the Reich Main Security Office, RSSHA, he oversaw the Gestapo, the criminal police, and the SD, placing him at the apex of the regime's internal security and intelligence apparatus. He was also a principal architect of anti-Jewish policy and one of the key coordinators of what became known as the Final Solution. His role in convening and chairing the Wannsee Conference in January 1942 alone would have guaranteed his centrality in any post-war prosecution. At Nuremberg, the Allies sought to demonstrate not only that atrocities had been committed, but that they were the result of deliberate policy directed by identifiable individuals. Heydrich fit that prosecutorial objective almost perfectly. The Nuremberg Tribunal operated under a novel legal framework, charging defendants with crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. For Heydrich, all three categories would have been applicable. Although he was not primarily a military commander, his senior role in the SS and his influence on occupied territory policy would have linked him to aggressive war, and to the conduct of that war in ways similar to those used against figures like Hermann Göring and Wilhelm Keitel. More decisively, however, the prosecution would have focused on crimes against humanity, mass murder, persecution on racial and political grounds, deportation, and enslavement. In this respect, Heydrich's responsibility would have exceeded that of most actual Nuremberg defendants. The evidence against him would have been overwhelming. The Allies had already captured a vast documentary record of Nazi bureaucratic activity, including RSHA files, Einsatzgruppen reports, and correspondence linking Heydrich to mass shootings in Eastern Europe. Einsatzgruppen leaders who were subordinate to Heydrich had reported directly to him on the number of Jews, Roma, communists, and others murdered in occupied Soviet territories. These reports, some of which were introduced in later trials, provided numerical detail that made denial difficult. Unlike lower-ranking officers, Heydrich could not plausibly claim ignorance. The documentary trail pointed to his role as planner, coordinator, and overseer. In addition to documents, witness testimony would have played a major role. Surviving SS officials, civil servants, and military officers might have testified about Heydrich's authority and methods. He had a reputation even within the Nazi hierarchy for ruthlessness and ideological zeal, and many of his colleagues feared him. At Nuremberg, defendants often attempted to shift blame upward or downward in the chain of command. In Heydrich's case, many subordinates would have had an incentive to emphasize his central role, reinforcing the prosecution's case that he was not merely following Hitler's orders, but actively shaping policy. Heydrich's own defense strategy, had he been alive to mount one, can be inferred from patterns seen among other SS leaders. He likely would have argued that he acted under orders from Adolf Hitler and Heinrich Himmler, and that he was carrying out state policy in a time of war. He might also have tried to challenge the tribunal's jurisdiction or the retroactive application of international law, arguments commonly raised by defendants. However, the Nuremberg judges consistently rejected superior orders as a full defense, treating it at most as a mitigating factor. Given Heydrich's seniority and initiative, even mitigation would have been unlikely. Comparison with other defendants is instructive. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, who succeeded Heydrich as head of the RSHA after 1943, was tried and executed at Nuremberg. Despite attempting to distance himself from earlier crimes and to portray himself as less powerful than his predecessor, Kaltenbrunner was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The tribunal accepted that the RSHA was a criminal organization and that its head bore responsibility for its actions. Since Heydrich had been more deeply involved in the formation and early operation of the RSHA, and more directly connected to the initiation of the Final Solution, his culpability would have been even clearer. The charge of crimes against humanity would have been particularly devastating. The prosecution at Nuremberg sought to show that the Holocaust was not an accidental byproduct of war, but a systematic, state-sponsored campaign of extermination. Heydrich's role at Wannsee where the logistical coordination of Jewish deportations to killing centers was discussed, would have been central evidence. Even if Heydrich had attempted to downplay the meeting as administrative, the broader context of his actions before and after would have undermined such claims. The tribunal was prepared to infer intent from patterns of behavior and policy outcomes, and Heydrich's record showed consistent intent to persecute and destroy entire populations. It is also likely that Heydrich would have been charged with responsibility for atrocities in occupied Czechoslovakia and elsewhere in Western Europe. As acting Reich protector of Bohemia and Moravia, he oversaw brutal reprisals against resistance, including mass arrests and executions. The destruction of Lidis after his assassination became emblematic of Nazi terror, and although that particular crime occurred after his death, his general policy of repression in the Protectorate would still have been scrutinized. These actions reinforce the image of Heydrich not only as a bureaucratic planner, but as a direct enforcer of terror. The political symbolism of trying Heydrich at Nuremberg would also have mattered. The Allies intended the trial to serve as a moral reckoning and a historical record. Putting one of the principal architects of Nazi terror in the dock would have strengthened that narrative. Prosecutors would likely have highlighted his career as evidence of how educated, ambitious individuals could become agents of mass murder within a totalitarian system. In that sense, Heydrich's trial would have been used to illustrate the broader criminality of the SS and the Nazi state. As for the verdict, there is little doubt that Heydrich would have been found guilty on multiple counts. His leadership position, the scale of the crimes associated with his agencies, and the direct documentary evidence tying him to those crimes would have left the tribunal with few alternatives. The sentence would almost certainly have been death. At Nuremberg, 12 of the defendants were sentenced to death by hanging, including figures with less direct involvement in mass murder than Heydrich. The judges reserved the harshest penalties for those they saw as central to the regime's criminal policies, and Heydrich would have ranked among the most central. Beyond the legal outcome, Heydrich's hypothetical presence at Nuremberg might have influenced historical understanding of the Holocaust. His testimony, even if evasive, could have provided additional insight into decision-making processes within the Nazi leadership. At the same time, his execution would have reinforced the tribunal's message that those who design and direct crimes bear the greatest responsibility, regardless of whether they personally pulled the trigger. In sum, had Reinhard Heydrich survived the war and been brought before the International Military Tribunal, he would have stood as one of its most significant defendants. The legal framework of Nuremberg, the abundance of evidence, and the tribunal's approach to individual responsibility all point to a swift conviction and a death sentence. While history denied the Allies the opportunity to confront him in court, the standards established at Nuremberg make his likely fate there one of the least uncertain counterfactuals of the post-war reckoning.